A millionaire dismissed his intern's ideas as foolish. Days later, she was celebrated worldwide for a groundbreaking innovation he had overlooked. The faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the expansive conference room of Preston Enterprises, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of papers and nervous murmurs. A sense of anticipation and unease hung in the air. At the center of it all was Charles Preston, the mastermind behind one of the largest conglomerates in the country. Charles was a man who commanded attention simply by walking into a room. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, he exuded an aura of power and precision. His sharp blue eyes, set beneath a furrowed brow, swept over the room, leaving no one unscathed. "All right," he began, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. "I don't have all day. Let's hear something that matters." The executives around the long, gleaming table straightened their postures. Charles's reputation for brilliance was equaled only by his intolerance for mediocrity. He didn't suffer fools, and he made sure everyone knew it. His gestures were measured, every movement deliberate, as though he'd choreographed the entire scene. Even as he sipped his coffee, black, no sugar, it was clear that he ruled this room, this company, this world. At the far end of the table sat Jane Porter, barely noticeable amidst the sea of seasoned professionals. Her auburn hair was tied neatly into a low ponytail, her simple blazer a stark contrast to the polished Armani and Hugo Boss surrounding her. Jane was an intern, a fresh graduate still clutching onto the hope that hard work and ingenuity could make up for a lack of pedigree. Her hazel eyes darted nervously between the faces around her, searching for a moment to speak, though she knew better than to interrupt the flow of Preston's kingdom. Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his eyes narrowing at the first presenter. "Make it good," he warned. His tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through any pretense of comfort. The presentation began. A meticulously prepared report on a proposed expansion into Southeast Asia. The presenter, a seasoned executive in his mid-40s, spoke with rehearsed confidence, gesturing toward the sleek slides on the wall behind him. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, it became apparent that Charles was less than impressed. His brow furrowed deeper with every word, and by the time the presentation ended, the room was deathly silent. "That's it?" Charles asked, his voice laced with disdain. "You've wasted 10 minutes of my life to tell me what I already knew." The presenter fumbled for a response, but Charles waved him off. "Next," he barked, his piercing gaze scanning the room. "Who's got something better?" Jane's heart pounded in her chest. She had been working on an idea for weeks, an innovation in supply chain logistics that could potentially save the company millions. It was bold, untested, and precisely the kind of thing Charles Preston claimed to value. But in this moment, surrounded by skepticism and fear, doubt crept in. What if he dismissed her too? What if she wasn't ready? Anyone? Charles's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. His eyes landed briefly on Jane, and she felt a jolt of adrenaline. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jane raised her hand. The room fell silent as heads turned toward her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. An intern? Speaking up in this room? The audacity was almost laughable. Charles arched an eyebrow. "Well, this should be interesting. Go ahead, Miss Porter. The floor is yours." Jane rose slowly, her knees threatening to give way beneath her. Her hands gripped the edge of the table for support, and she took a deep breath. "Mr. Preston," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I've been analyzing our supply chain operations, and I believe there's an opportunity to implement AI-driven predictive analysis. It could optimize our logistics, reduce delays, and potentially cut costs by up to 25%. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Charles leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "AI-driven predictive analysis? Let me guess, you read about it in a tech blog and thought, why not bring it to the big leagues?" The room erupted in muted chuckles, and Jane's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. But she held her ground. "I've run simulations using sample data from our Midwest division," she continued, her voice steadying. "The results were promising. With a modest investment in infrastructure, we could see significant returns." Charles tapped his fingers on the table, his expression a mixture of amusement and condescension. Promising, you say? You know what's also promising? My nephew's lemonade stand. Doesn't mean I'm pouring money into it. More laughter. Jane felt the heat rise to her face, but she refused to back down. I understand your skepticism, Mr. Preston, she said, her tone firm, but I believe this is worth exploring. If given the chance, I can prove its viability. Charles leaned forward, his smirk fading. Let me tell you something, Miss Porter. Ideas are cheap. Execution is everything. And unless you can show me results, this is nothing more than a pipe dream. The finality in his tone was like a door slamming shut. Jane sat down, her head spinning with a mixture of anger and humiliation. She had risked everything to present her idea, only to have it dismissed with a few cutting remarks. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur as other executives presented their proposals. Each one met with varying degrees of disdain. When the meeting finally adjourned, Jane lingered in her seat, staring at the empty notepad in front of her. Around her, the room emptied quickly as the other executives rushed to escape Charles's wrath. Jane, however, remained rooted in place, her mind racing. She couldn't let this be the end. Charles Preston might have dismissed her idea, but she believed in it. She believed in herself, and as she gathered her belongings and walked out of the conference room, a new resolve began to form within her. She would refine her idea, find a way to prove its worth, no matter what it took. Unbeknownst to her, the decision she made in that moment would set off a chain of events that would change her life and Preston Enterprises forever. What would you do if your big idea was dismissed like that? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, give this video a thumbs up if you're hooked on the story so far. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. It's about to get even more intense. The clatter of footsteps echoed down the marble hallway as Jane Porter exited the conference room, clutching her laptop and a stack of notes to her chest like a shield. The humiliation from the meeting still burned, her cheeks flushed with the memory of Charles Preston's cutting remarks. Yet, beneath the sting of rejection, a quiet determination flickered. She knew her idea was more than just a gamble. It had the potential to revolutionize Preston Enterprises. Jane found refuge in a small break room at the far end of the building. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint hiss of the coffee machine were the only sounds as she settled into a chair, spreading her notes across the table. Her idea, an AI-driven system for supply chain optimization, was ambitious. She admitted that, but ambition was what had gotten her this far. Growing up in a small town where opportunities were scarce, Jane had learned early on that dreaming big was the only way to escape mediocrity. As she reviewed her notes, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Colin, a junior analyst from the logistics department. With his rumpled blazer and perpetually untamed hair, Colin was known for his dry humor and encyclopedic knowledge of operational data. "Rough meeting?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Jane looked up, offering a weak smile. "Is it that obvious?" Colin chuckled, stepping inside and grabbing a cup of coffee. "Charles Preston has a way of making everyone feel like an idiot. Don't take it personally." "I don't," Jane replied, though her voice betrayed her. She hesitated before adding, I know my idea has merit. I ran the numbers, built models. It could work." Colin sipped his coffee, his brow furrowing. "AI-driven logistics optimization, right? I caught part of your pitch. It's bold. Bold enough to be dismissed as a pipe dream," Jane muttered bitterly. Colin set his cup down and pulled out a chair across from her. "Look, Jane, bold ideas are risky, but they're also the ones that change the game. If you're convinced this could work, maybe you shouldn't give up so easily." Jane looked at him, surprised by the encouragement. "You think I should keep pushing it? Even after that?" Colin shrugged. "Preston's stubborn, but even he can't argue with results. Prove it works, and he'll have no choice but to listen." The word struck a chord. Prove it works. Jane straightened in her chair, her resolve solidifying. "You're right," she said. "I can't wait for someone else to see the value. I'll have to show them." Colin grinned. "That's the spirit. If you need help crunching numbers, you know where to find me." As Colin left the room, Jane turned back to her notes with renewed energy. If she was going to prove her idea's worth, she needed more than just simulations. She needed real-world data, something tangible to back up her projections. Over the next week, Jane threw herself into her work. During the day, she performed her regular intern duties, balancing spreadsheets and preparing reports. But at night, she stayed late, poring over supply chain data and refining her algorithms. With Colin's occasional input, she began creating a prototype for her predictive analysis model, using anonymized data from the company's Midwest division as a test case. The process was grueling. Jane encountered countless roadblocks, from incomplete datasets to technical glitches. There were nights when she sat alone in the dimly lit office, her head in her hands, wondering if she was in over her head. But every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself why she had started. She wasn't just fighting for an idea. She was fighting to be heard, to prove that someone like her, a nobody in a room full of elites, could make a difference. One evening, as she stared at her computer screen, her eyes blurry with exhaustion, a breakthrough came. Her algorithm had successfully predicted a series of supply chain disruptions based on historical trends and weather patterns. Not only that, but it had identified cost-saving measures that aligned perfectly with her initial projections. Jane sat back, her heart racing. It worked. It actually worked. The victory was short-lived, however. She knew that a working prototype was only half the battle. She needed buy-in from someone with influence, someone who could champion her idea when she couldn't. The following morning, Jane approached her immediate supervisor, Rachel Meyer, a sharp and pragmatic woman who had been with Preston Enterprises for over a decade. Rachel had always been fair to Jane, but she was also a realist who valued results over ambition. "Rachel, do you have a minute?" Jane asked, standing nervously in the doorway of her office. Rachel glanced up from her computer. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Jane stepped inside, clutching a folder containing her findings. "I've been working on something outside of my regular assignments. It's a model for optimizing our supply chain using AI. I think it could save the company a significant amount of money." Rachel leaned back in her chair, eyeing Jane with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "AI-driven logistics? That's ambitious." "I know it sounds risky," Jane admitted, "but I've built a prototype, and the initial results are promising. If you'd be willing to take a look." Rachel held up a hand. "Jane, I admire your initiative, but do you have any idea how many promising ideas cross my desk every week?" "Charles doesn't care about promising. He cares about certainty." Jane's shoulders sagged slightly, but she pressed on. "If I can show you solid results, numbers that prove the value, would you consider backing me?" Rachel studied her for a long moment before sighing. "All right, Jane, bring me something concrete, and I'll think about it. But don't get your hopes up. Charles doesn't change his mind easily." It wasn't the resounding support Jane had hoped for, but it was a start. As she left Rachel's office, her determination only grew stronger. She knew her idea could work. She just had to find a way to make the rest of the world see it too. By the end of the week, Jane had refined her prototype and compiled a comprehensive report detailing her findings. She stayed up until the early hours of the morning preparing a polished presentation, complete with visuals and real-world scenarios. Exhausted but energized, she sent the materials to Rachel, hoping it would be enough to convince her. As she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, Jane allowed herself a small moment of pride. She had come so far in such a short time, and regardless of the outcome, she knew she had given it her all. What Jane didn't realize was that the wheels of change were already beginning to turn. Her determination and ingenuity would soon set off a series of events that would not only challenge Charles Preston's authority, but also catapult her into the spotlight in ways she could never have anticipated. The boardroom was alive with the quiet murmur of voices, executives flipping through notes or scrolling on their devices. Attention hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. Jane Porter sat at the far end of the glossy table, her laptop open and her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. Despite the neatly arranged slides and rehearsed talking points, her palms were damp and her heart raced. This was it, her chance to prove herself, to show Charles Preston and everyone in the room that she had something of value. The door opened abruptly and silence fell. Charles Preston strode in with his signature confidence, his polished shoes tapping a deliberate rhythm on the hardwood floor. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, he exuded authority. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room as if cataloging every individual and weighing their worth in a single glance. He took his seat at the head of the table, setting his leather folder down with an air of finality. "Good morning," Charles began, his tone clipped and direct. "Let's get this started. Time is money, and I expect none of it to be wasted." His gaze landed on Jane. "Miss Porter, you've been rather persistent about this proposal of yours. Let's see what all the fuss is about." Jane swallowed hard, standing as all eyes turned toward her. She clicked to open her presentation on the projector, the first slide lighting up the wall behind her with clean, bold graphics. She had spent countless nights perfecting these visuals, ensuring every detail was clear and compelling. "Thank you, Mr. Preston," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. "Today, I'd like to present a model for optimizing our supply chain using AI-driven predictive analysis. Over the past few weeks, I've conducted simulations using data from our Midwest division. The results indicate a potential cost reduction of up to 25%, along with significant improvements in delivery times and customer satisfaction." She advanced to the next slide, detailing the methodology behind her model. Her voice grew more confident as she explained the system's ability to analyze historical data, identify potential disruptions, and recommend proactive measures. She could see a few executives nodding along, their interest piqued. Jane glanced at Charles, hoping for a sign of approval, but his expression remained unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "This model," she continued, "has the potential to position Preston Enterprises as a leader in operational efficiency. It's not just about saving money. It's about staying ahead of the curve in a competitive market." When she reached the final slide, Jane took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she faced the room. "Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions." The silence that followed was deafening. Jane's heart thudded in her ears as she scanned the room, waiting for someone to speak. Finally, Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His fingers tapped lightly against his chin as he regarded her with a smirk that sent a chill down her spine. "Well," he began, his voice slow and deliberate. "That was thorough. I'll give you that." Jane's pulse quickened with a flicker of hope, but his next words extinguished it in an instant. "But thorough doesn't mean viable," Charles said, his tone turning sharp. "What you've presented here is a theory. A very polished theory, sure, but it's just that, a theory. Tell me, Miss Porter, have you considered the real-world implications of this grand idea of yours? The costs, the risks, the inevitable failures?" Jane opened her mouth to respond, but Charles cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This company doesn't operate on promises or potential. We deal in results. Concrete, measurable results. And until you can show me something more than simulations, your model is nothing more than a pipe dream." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the room. Jane's cheeks burned as she felt every pair of eyes on her. She clenched her fists at her sides, willing herself not to shrink under the weight of his words. "Mr. Preston," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "I understand the risks, but I believe the potential rewards far outweigh them. If we—" Charles raised a hand, silencing her. "Enough, Miss Porter. I've heard all I need to hear. Thank you for your enthusiasm, but we'll be moving on." And just like that, it was over. Jane sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as she stared down at her notes. The next presenter began setting up, but their words were a blur. All she could hear was Charles's dismissal echoing in her mind. A pipe dream, nothing more. By the time the meeting ended, Jane remained seated as the executives filed out of the room. Rachel Meyer, her supervisor, paused briefly by her side. "I'm sorry, Jane," Rachel said softly. "You gave it your best shot." Jane forced a weak smile. "Thanks, Rachel." As Rachel left, Jane gathered her belongings, her mind racing. She had spent weeks perfecting her model, pouring every ounce of her energy into something she truly believed in. And now, in the span of 15 minutes, it had been dismissed as if it were nothing. She retreated to the break room, sinking into a chair with her untouched coffee in front of her. Colin, the junior analyst who had helped her with some of the data, found her there. "Hey," he said, sitting across from her. "Heard about the meeting. Preston's a jerk. Don't let it get to you." "I thought I could convince him," Jane said, her voice hollow. "I thought if I showed him the numbers, he'd see the value." "Preston doesn't see value unless it's in his bank account," Colin said. "But that doesn't mean your idea's bad. It's a good idea, Jane. You just need a different approach." Jane stared into her coffee, her mind swirling with doubt and frustration. "What's the point?" she murmured. "If he won't listen, what can I do?" Colin leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Prove him wrong. Take the model, refine it, find someone who will listen. Just don't let him make you doubt yourself." His words sparked something in her, a flicker of the determination that had carried her this far. She straightened in her chair, her hazel eyes narrowing with resolve. Colin was right. Charles Preston might have dismissed her today, but that didn't mean the idea was dead. She just needed to find another way. As Jane left the office that evening, the sting of humiliation still lingered, but so did a new sense of purpose. She had faced rejection before, and she had always found a way to rise above it. This time would be no different. What she didn't know was that her determination was about to set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of Preston Enterprises and redefine her future. The rain poured in steady sheets outside the office window, a fitting backdrop to Jane Porter's inner turmoil. The events of the boardroom replayed in her mind on an endless loop. Charles Preston's dismissive smirk, his sharp words cutting through her like a blade, a pipe dream. Nothing more. The humiliation had been stinging, but it was the dismissal of her hard work, the core of her belief, that left an ache she couldn't shake. Sitting at her desk after hours, the office eerily quiet, Jane stared at her laptop screen. The glowing charts and graphs of her AI-driven logistics model mocked her. She had poured weeks into refining every detail, but it had all amounted to nothing in the eyes of Preston Enterprises' iron-fisted leader. But was it truly nothing? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant yet unwilling to close the document. Somewhere deep inside her, a stubborn resolve began to build. If Preston wouldn't listen, she'd have to prove her ideas worth another way. She didn't know how yet, but she knew giving up wasn't an option. The next morning, Jane arrived at work with a new determination. She decided she would refine her model further, despite the rejection. After all, she hadn't climbed out of her modest upbringing by accepting defeat. Born to a single mother in a small town, Jane had learned early on that success wasn't handed out. It was fought for, piece by piece. During her lunch break, she found herself seated across from Colin in the company cafeteria. The junior analyst had become an unexpected ally, always quick to offer advice or encouragement. Today was no different. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Jane began, poking at her salad with a fork. "About proving him wrong." Colin raised an eyebrow. "And I want to keep working on it. Refine the model, maybe test it on a smaller scale. If I can show real results, maybe he'll have no choice but to listen." Colin leaned back in his chair, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "That's the spirit. You've got guts, Porter. Most people would have folded after what happened in that meeting." Jane shrugged, her determination masking the lingering vulnerability. "I don't have the luxury of folding. This idea, it's too important to let go." "Well," Colin said, leaning forward, "you've got my support. Let me know what you need." Over the next several days, Jane threw herself into her work with a renewed vigor. She began tweaking her algorithms, digging into more datasets to test her predictions. She combed through years of supply chain records, identifying patterns and trends that her model could improve upon. Each discovery brought her closer to proving her concept's viability. But there were hurdles. Without the official backing of Preston Enterprises, Jane had limited access to the resources she needed. The company's strict data access protocols were designed to prevent misuse, but they also hindered innovation from people like Jane, outsiders without titles or influence. She found herself working late into the night, often borrowing Colin's expertise to navigate these challenges. "You know," Colin said one evening as they pored over spreadsheets in a deserted conference room, You're basically doing the work of an entire team by yourself. You ever sleep? Not as much as I should, Jane admitted with a tired smile. But this is too important to let slide. He chuckled. Well, just don't burn out. We're rooting for you. As the weeks passed, Jane's progress began to show promise. The refined model was not only more accurate but also faster at identifying inefficiencies. One evening, as she ran a final test on a new dataset, the results appeared on her screen like a beacon of hope. Her predictions had led to a theoretical savings of over $2 million for the Midwest division alone. Jane sat back in her chair, the weight of her efforts suddenly feeling lighter. The next challenge was finding a way to implement her model in a real-world scenario. Jane knew that presenting her findings to Charles Preston again would be futile without tangible results. She needed a partner, someone willing to take a chance on her innovation. That night, as she stared at the glowing skyline from her apartment window, an idea struck her. Preston Enterprises wasn't the only company in the industry. Perhaps she could approach a smaller, more agile company to test her model. It was a risk, one that could jeopardize her standing at Preston if discovered, but it was a risk she was willing to take. The next day, Jane began researching potential collaborators. Her search led her to Horizon Logistics, a regional company known for its innovative approach to supply chain management. Horizon wasn't a direct competitor to Preston Enterprises, but it operated in a similar space and had a reputation for embracing new ideas. Jane crafted a pitch email, carefully explaining her model and the potential benefits it could bring to Horizon. She hesitated before hitting send, the weight of what she was doing pressing down on her. If anyone at Preston found out, it could spell the end of her career. But the alternative, letting her idea wither away, felt far worse. Days passed without a response, and Jane began to question her decision. Then, one afternoon, her phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Horizon. The subject line read, "Let's talk." Her heart raced as she opened the email. The company's operations manager, Lisa Carter, was interested in her proposal and wanted to schedule a call. It was the first glimmer of validation Jane had received since her initial rejection, and it reignited her hope. The call with Horizon went better than Jane could have imagined. Lisa was intrigued by the model and impressed by Jane's determination. After reviewing the preliminary data, Horizon agreed to pilot the system on a limited basis. The partnership was informal, off the books, but it was exactly the opportunity Jane needed. For the next month, Jane worked tirelessly with Horizon's team to implement her model. She refined the algorithms based on real-time data, making adjustments to account for unexpected variables. The process was exhausting but exhilarating. For the first time, her idea wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was making a tangible impact. When the pilot program concluded, the results spoke for themselves: a 22% reduction in logistics costs and a marked improvement in delivery times. Horizon's leadership was thrilled, and Jane felt a surge of pride she hadn't experienced before. She had taken a leap of faith, and it had paid off. As she stood in Horizon's modest headquarters, watching the team celebrate the success of the pilot, Jane knew this was only the beginning. The world would soon see the potential of her innovation, even if Charles Preston had been too blind to recognize it. What Jane couldn't yet predict was how this success would ripple back to Preston Enterprises, setting the stage for a confrontation that would redefine both her career and Charles's legacy. The conference room at Horizon Logistics buzzed with energy as the leadership team gathered to review the results of Jane Porter's pilot program. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the cold, rigid environment of Preston Enterprises. Here, the air felt alive, charged with possibility. Jane stood near the projector screen, her confidence bolstered by the validation she had long sought. On the table in front of her were the final reports, meticulously prepared to showcase the undeniable success of her AI-driven logistics model. Lisa Carter, Horizon's operations manager, gestured for the room to quiet down. A pragmatic woman in her early 40s, Lisa was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and sharp instincts. "All right, Jane," she said, leaning back in her chair. "The floor is yours." Jane nodded, her hazel eyes gleaming with determination. "Thank you, Lisa. Over the past month, we've tested the predictive model across Horizon's Midwest operations. The goal was to optimize supply chain efficiency by predicting potential disruptions and implementing proactive solutions. As you can see, she clicked to the first slide, displaying a bar graph that highlighted cost reductions. The system achieved a 22% decrease in logistics costs and a 15% improvement in delivery times. Murmurs of approval rippled through the room as Jane walked them through the results. She spoke with a clarity and confidence that came from knowing her work was no longer theoretical. It had been tested, proven, and embraced by a company willing to take a chance on her vision. Beyond the numbers, Jane continued, the model has also enhanced Horizon's ability to adapt to unforeseen challenges, such as weather disruptions and supplier delays. This adaptability positions the company as a leader in operational efficiency. Lisa raised a hand, signaling Jane to pause. I think we can all agree the results are impressive, she said, her tone thoughtful. But I'd like to hear more about scalability. How confident are you that this model could be applied to larger operations? Jane had anticipated the question. The principles behind the model remain the same, regardless of scale. While certain variables may require adjustment, the core algorithm is designed to handle increased data loads without compromising accuracy. With the right infrastructure, the system could easily be scaled to larger networks. Lisa nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer. Thank you, Jane. You've done remarkable work here. The meeting concluded with resounding approval from Horizon's leadership. As Jane packed up her materials, Lisa approached her. Jane, I'd like to discuss next steps. There's real potential here, and I think Horizon would be interested in formalizing this partnership. Jane's heart raced at the prospect. Thank you, Lisa. That means a lot. Lisa smiled. You've earned it. Let's schedule a time to hash out the details. News of Horizon's success spread quickly, fueled by glowing reviews from industry insiders. What had started as a modest pilot program began to garner attention from larger players in the logistics sector. Within weeks, Jane's model became the subject of industry blogs and trade publications, hailed as a groundbreaking innovation that could redefine supply chain management. At Preston Enterprises, the ripple effects were beginning to be felt. Charles Preston sat in his expansive office, scrolling through an article on his tablet. The headline read, Horizon Logistics achieves record efficiency with AI-driven model. His jaw tightened as he read the details, recognizing the concepts Jane had presented in his boardroom weeks earlier. The very pipe dream he had dismissed was now making waves in the industry. He tossed the tablet onto his desk, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Rachel, he barked into the intercom, get me the latest reports on Horizon Logistics. I want everything we have on them. Minutes later, Rachel Meyer entered with a folder of documents. She placed it on his desk, her expression cautious. Horizon's been making headlines lately, she said. Their pilot program has everyone talking. Charles flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing as he scanned the data. This model, he muttered, his tone laced with disbelief. It's almost identical to what Porter pitched. Rachel hesitated before speaking. It is her model, Charles. Jane partnered with Horizon after it wasn't approved here. Charles's hand froze mid-turn of a page. He looked up at Rachel, his piercing blue eyes narrowing. She took it to Horizon? She did, Rachel confirmed, her voice steady. And it looks like they've proven its success. Charles leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He prided himself on being a visionary, someone who recognized potential where others didn't. Yet, he had overlooked this. Worse, he had dismissed it outright. Now, that oversight was costing Preston Enterprises both financially and reputationally. Bring her to me, he said finally, his voice sharp. Rachel hesitated. Jane's no longer with the company. She resigned a few weeks ago. Charles's jaw tightened further. Find a way to contact her. I want a meeting. While Preston Enterprises scrambled to address the fallout, Jane was navigating her newfound success with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Offers were pouring in from companies eager to collaborate or acquire her model, but she was careful to weigh her options. Horizon had given her the chance to prove herself, and she felt a sense of loyalty to them. Still, she couldn't ignore the larger opportunities that lay ahead. One evening, as she reviewed her emails, a familiar name appeared in her inbox, Rachel Meyer. The subject line read, "An invitation to meet." Jane opened the email, her heart pounding as she read the message. Rachel, writing on behalf of Charles Preston, expressed an interest in discussing potential opportunities and requested a meeting at Preston Enterprises. Jane stared at the screen, a flurry of emotions washing over her. She hadn't expected this, not after the way she'd been treated. Part of her wanted to delete the email and move on, but another part, driven by curiosity and a lingering sense of justice, considered the possibility of facing Charles Preston once more. She closed her laptop, her decision not yet made. For now, she allowed herself a moment to reflect on how far she had come. Just weeks ago, she had been an intern dismissed as a dreamer. Now, she was a rising star in the industry, her innovation celebrated worldwide. Whatever came next, Jane knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the timid intern who had walked into Preston Enterprises hoping to be noticed. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the storm she had unleashed was only just beginning. The announcement of Horizon Logistics' groundbreaking success with Jane Porter's AI-driven logistics model spread like wildfire across the industry. Trade publications, industry forums, and even mainstream business news outlets were buzzing with articles that praised the innovation. Phrases like game changer, revolutionary, and the future of logistics accompanied every mention of her name. Jane Porter, once an unnoticed intern, was now a figure of intrigue and admiration. Sitting in her modest apartment, Jane scrolled through an endless stream of notifications on her phone. LinkedIn connections poured in, emails flooded her inbox, and her name trended in logistics circles. It was overwhelming but exhilarating. Horizon Logistics had given her a stage, but it was the power of her model and the undeniable results that had captivated the world. That week, Jane was invited to speak at a prestigious industry event, the Global Supply Chain Summit. The invitation alone was a testament to her newfound influence. Attendees ranged from startup founders to CEOs of multinational corporations, all eager to hear about the innovation that was reshaping their industry. For Jane, it was an opportunity not just to showcase her work, but also to solidify her place as a thought leader. The day of the summit arrived, and Jane found herself backstage, nervously adjusting the microphone clipped to her blazer. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through her notes one last time. Public speaking wasn't her forte, but she knew this was more than just a presentation. It was her moment. "Jane, you're up," said a stage manager, motioning toward the entrance. Taking a deep breath, Jane stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, and the sea of faces in the audience made her pulse quicken. But as she reached the podium, a calmness settled over her. She had lived and breathed this model for months. If anyone could tell its story, it was her. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "When I first developed this model, it wasn't about chasing headlines or accolades. It was about solving a problem, an age-old challenge in supply chain management, unpredictability." She clicked to the first slide, which displayed data from Horizon's pilot program. By leveraging AI, we've moved from reactive responses to proactive strategies. This shift has allowed us to save time, cut costs, and deliver better outcomes for our partners and customers. As Jane continued, the audience leaned in, captivated by her blend of technical expertise and personal passion. She didn't just present numbers. She told the story behind them, her late nights, her belief in the idea when no one else did, and the journey that had led her here. The applause that erupted when she finished was thunderous. Jane felt a wave of relief and pride as she stepped away from the podium. Backstage, Lisa Carter from Horizon greeted her with a wide grin. "You nailed it," Lisa said, clapping her on the shoulder. "The industry's never going to forget your name after this." Meanwhile, at Preston Enterprises, the buzz around Jane's success was impossible to ignore. Charles Preston sat in his expansive office, staring at a live stream of Jane's presentation. Her name, once an afterthought, was now unavoidable. The chatter among industry leaders and competitors painted a grim picture. Preston Enterprises had not only missed out on a significant innovation, but also allowed it to slip into the hands of a rival. Charles clenched his jaw as he replayed the events that had led to this moment. He had dismissed her too quickly, underestimated her persistence, and now, the consequences were glaringly apparent. Employees whispered about the missed opportunity, and shareholders began raising questions. For a man who prided himself on being ahead of the curve, it was a humbling realization. "Rachel," he called into the intercom, his voice unusually subdued. Rachel Meyer entered, her expression cautious. She had sensed the shift in Charles's demeanor over the past week. His typical arrogance was tempered by something she hadn't seen before: uncertainty. "Yes, Charles," she asked. "Where are we with contacting Jane Porter?" he asked, his tone clipped. "She's agreed to meet," Rachel replied. "But under her conditions." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Her conditions?" Rachel nodded. "She insisted on an independent setting. Neutral ground. No boardrooms, no theatrics." Charles leaned back in his chair, a flicker of amusement breaking through his frustration. "Smart girl." As Jane's reputation soared, offers from major corporations poured in. Tech giants, logistics firms, and venture capitalists all clamored for a chance to partner with her. Each email and phone call was a reminder of how far she had come, and how drastically her circumstances had changed. One evening, as Jane sifted through her inbox, a message from Rachel Meyer caught her eye. The subject line read, "A conversation with Charles Preston." Jane stared at the email, a mix of emotions swirling within her. She had expected Preston Enterprises to reach out eventually, but seeing it in writing brought back a flood of memories. The dismissal, the humiliation, the feeling of being invisible. Part of her wanted to ignore the message, to relish the irony of them now seeking her out. But another part, the part that believed in growth and integrity, considered the opportunity. After a long moment, she clicked reply. The meeting was set for the following week at a quiet cafe downtown. Jane chose the location deliberately, neutral ground where she could feel at ease. When the day arrived, she sat by the window, sipping her coffee as she waited for Charles Preston to arrive. She had envisioned this moment countless times, but now that it was here, she felt oddly calm. Charles entered a few minutes later, his imposing figure immediately recognizable. He wore a tailored gray suit, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a humility she hadn't seen before. As he approached, Jane rose to greet him, her expression poised but unreadable. "Miss Porter," Charles said, extending a hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Jane shook his hand briefly, then gestured for him to sit. "I was curious to hear what you had to say." Charles took a seat, his sharp blue eyes studying her. For the first time, he looked less like the untouchable mogul and more like a man reckoning with his mistakes. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "I misjudged you. Your work, your vision. It's clear now that I was wrong to dismiss it. And for that, I owe you an apology." Jane raised an eyebrow, her surprise hidden behind a calm exterior. "An apology doesn't change what happened, Mr. Preston." "No, it doesn't," Charles admitted. "But I believe there's an opportunity for us to work together, to bring your innovation to a larger scale." Jane leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "You had that opportunity, and you let it slip away. Why should I trust you now?" Charles paused, the question hanging heavily in the air. For once, the man who always had the answers seemed at a loss. "Because," he said finally, "I recognize talent when I see it, and I'm willing to make things right." The conversation continued, but Jane made no commitments. She had worked too hard to let anyone else control her narrative. As she left the cafe, she felt a sense of closure. Charles Preston might have underestimated her once, but he would never make that mistake again. What Jane couldn't yet foresee was how this meeting would lead to the next pivotal chapter in her journey, a chapter that would cement her legacy and redefine the future of innovation. The crisp morning air carried a sense of anticipation as Jane Porter arrived at the headquarters of Preston Enterprises. The towering glass structure gleamed in the sunlight, a monument to Charles Preston's empire. Yet, for the first time, Jane felt no intimidation as she walked through its marble-floored lobby. Today, she wasn't the overlooked intern. Today, she was the woman whose innovation had set the industry ablaze. Rachel Meyer greeted her at the reception desk, her usual reserved demeanor softened by a warm smile. "Jane, thank you for coming. Mr. Preston is waiting in the executive conference room." Jane nodded, her expression unreadable. As they walked through the labyrinth of offices and corridors, she couldn't help but notice the curious glances from employees. Whispers followed her, some filled with awe, others tinged with speculation. It was clear that Jane's name had become a topic of fascination within these walls. When they reached the conference room, Rachel held the door open for her. Jane stepped inside to find Charles Preston standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her as he gazed out at the city skyline. The room, with its sleek furnishings and panoramic views, exuded the same sense of power and authority as its occupant. "Miss Porter," Charles said, turning to face her. His tone was cordial, almost deferential, a stark contrast to the man who had dismissed her so easily months ago. "Thank you for meeting with me." Jane took a seat at the long table, setting her laptop down with deliberate precision. "Let's get to the point, Mr. Preston. Why am I here?" Charles walked over, his movements measured. He sat across from her, folding his hands on the table. For a moment, he studied her, his piercing blue eyes searching for something. Perhaps a crack in her armor, but finding none. "You've accomplished something remarkable," he began, his voice steady. "Your work with Horizon Logistics has not only proven the value of your model, but has also set a new standard for the industry. Preston Enterprises needs innovation like that to stay competitive." Jane raised an eyebrow. "Interesting choice of words. Because when I presented this model to you, you called it a pipe dream." Charles inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her point. "I was wrong. I underestimated both you and the potential of your idea, and I've paid the price for that misjudgment." Jane leaned back in her chair, her hazel eyes unwavering. "So, what now? You want to buy the model? Or are you looking for me to come back to the company?" Charles hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I'm offering you a partnership," he said finally. "A chance to implement your system on a global scale, with the full resources of Preston Enterprises at your disposal." Jane tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "A partnership? That's a generous offer, considering how little value you saw in me before." "I've learned from my mistakes," Charles admitted, his voice quieter now. "And I've learned to recognize talent when it's staring me in the face. I believe in second chances, Miss Porter. I hope you do too." The tension in the room was palpable as the two sat in silence. Jane's mind raced, weighing the pros and cons of his proposal. On one hand, Preston Enterprises' resources could take her innovation to heights she'd never imagined. On the other hand, partnering with Charles Preston meant aligning herself with the man who had once humiliated her in front of an entire boardroom. She broke the silence with a measured response. "If I were to consider this partnership, I'd need assurances, complete autonomy over the implementation and development of the model. No interference." Charles nodded. "Agreed." "And," Jane continued, her tone firm, "a significant equity stake in any division utilizing my system. This isn't just about technology. It's about ownership." A flicker of surprise crossed Charles's face, but he quickly masked it. "That's bold," he said. "But fair." Jane folded her hands on the table. "Then we have something to discuss." Over the next several hours, Jane and Charles negotiated the terms of their partnership. It was a battle of wits, each pushing and pulling to secure their positions. Jane was relentless, refusing to back down on key points. She had spent too long being underestimated to settle for anything less than what she deserved. By the time they reached an agreement, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city skyline. Charles extended a hand across the table. "Welcome to the team, Miss Porter." Jane shook his hand, her grip firm. "It's not your team anymore, Mr. Preston. It's ours." The partnership was announced a week later, sparking a media frenzy. Headlines declared it a bold move for Preston Enterprises, a sign of Charles Preston's ability to adapt in the face of industry shifts. But within the company, whispers told a different story. A story of redemption for Jane Porter and a reckoning for Charles Preston. Employees who had once scoffed at Jane's ideas now watched in awe as she walked the halls with confidence, her presence a reminder of the cost of underestimating vision and determination. Charles, for his part, seemed to accept the shift in dynamics with quiet grace. He had learned, perhaps for the first time, that leadership wasn't about ego but about recognizing and empowering those who could drive change. As the months passed, Jane's system was rolled out across Preston Enterprises' global operations, achieving results even more impressive than she had anticipated. The partnership thrived, but it was clear to everyone that the driving force behind the company's resurgence wasn't Charles Preston. It was Jane Porter. One afternoon, as Jane stood in the same conference room where she had once been dismissed, she looked out at the skyline and allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had faced humiliation and rejection, but she had turned those experiences into fuel for her success. And now, standing at the pinnacle of her career, she knew the journey had been worth it. But this wasn't the end. Jane Porter had only just begun. The spotlight was brighter than Jane Porter had ever imagined. Her partnership with Preston Enterprises had catapulted the company into new heights, solidifying its reputation as an industry leader once more. Shareholders cheered the turnaround, media outlets praised the innovation, and industry competitors scrambled to keep up. At the center of it all was Jane, a symbol of resilience, brilliance, and the power of underdog determination. But with the accolades came an undercurrent of tension. Charles Preston, a man used to being the face of his empire, found himself in an unfamiliar position, a supporting role. Though the partnership had been productive, the balance of power was unmistakable. Jane's influence was growing, and the company's success was increasingly tied to her name rather than his. Charles, for all his charm and calculated moves, was a man who had built his legacy on control. And now, he was beginning to feel it slip. The culmination of their partnership came in the form of a prestigious industry gala. Held in a glittering ballroom in downtown Manhattan, the event was an annual celebration of the logistics and supply chain sector's most transformative achievements. This year, the spotlight was firmly on Preston Enterprises, thanks to the success of Jane's AI-driven model. The room buzzed with anticipation as attendees mingled, champagne flutes in hand. Jane stood near the edge of the crowd, wearing an elegant navy gown that contrasted sharply with the business attire she had once worn as an intern. Her poise was magnetic, her smile confident but not ostentatious. Tonight, she wasn't just a guest, she was the star. Lisa Carter from Horizon Logistics approached her, a grin spreading across her face. "Look at you," Lisa said, raising her glass. "From the break room to the ballroom. How does it feel?" Jane chuckled, her expression thoughtful. Surreal, but also right. Like everything's finally falling into place. "Well, enjoy it," Lisa said. "You've earned every bit of this." As Lisa walked away, Jane's gaze drifted toward Charles, who stood at the center of a small group of executives. His tailored tuxedo was impeccable, and his charm was in full display as he laughed at a comment someone made. But Jane noticed something beneath the polished exterior, a flicker of discomfort, a crack in the armor. Later that evening, the crowd gathered for the highlight of the event, the presentation of the Industry Innovator Award. As the host took the stage and began to announce the winner, Jane felt her heart race. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, but the reality of being publicly recognized for her efforts was overwhelming. And the award for Industry Innovator of the Year goes to Jane Porter. The room erupted in applause as Jane made her way to the stage. The host handed her the gleaming award, and she turned to face the crowd, her emotions swirling. Pride, gratitude, and a touch of disbelief danced within her as she gripped the microphone. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "When I started this journey, I never imagined I'd be standing here today. This award isn't just for me. It's for everyone who believed in the power of innovation, even when it seemed impossible." Her gaze swept the crowd, pausing briefly on Charles. "To those who doubted me, thank you as well. You taught me the value of resilience. This journey wasn't easy, but it was worth every challenge." The applause that followed was thunderous. As Jane left the stage, she caught a glimpse of Charles clapping politely, his expression unreadable. Back at the table, Charles leaned closer to Jane, his tone low but measured. "Congratulations. You deserve it." Jane turned to him, her smile polite but guarded. "Thank you, Charles. That means a lot." He hesitated, his blue eyes searching hers. "I know this hasn't been an easy road for either of us, but I want you to know, I respect what you've accomplished." Jane nodded, her voice calm but firm. And I hope you've learned that dismissing someone's potential can be costly. Charles smirked faintly, a shadow of the arrogance he once wore so brazenly. I have. As the night wore on, Jane found herself reflecting on the twists and turns that had brought her here. Charles Preston had been an adversary, a partner, and in some strange way, a teacher. His dismissal of her idea had fueled her determination, and his eventual recognition of her talent had opened doors she hadn't thought possible. Yet, as she looked at the man who once loomed so large in her mind, she realized something profound. She no longer needed his validation. The next day, Jane met with Horizon's leadership to discuss a potential collaboration that would allow her to expand her model beyond Preston Enterprises. While she valued what the partnership had achieved, she knew it was time to chart her own course. Charles had built an empire, but Jane was building something far more enduring, a legacy. When she informed Charles of her decision to leave Preston Enterprises, his response was measured but telling. "You're a force, Jane," he said. "I only wish I'd seen it sooner." Jane smiled, extending a hand. "I think we both learned something from this, Charles." He shook her hand, his grip firm. "Indeed, we did." Months later, Jane's new venture was making headlines of its own, heralded as a beacon of innovation and leadership. Her story inspired countless young professionals, proving that determination and integrity could triumph over arrogance and doubt. And while Charles Preston remained a prominent figure, his role in Jane's journey was forever etched in the story. A reminder that even the greatest empires could learn to adapt, if only they were willing to listen.